Hey, hey everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Let me make my screen larger for everybody. Today we're going to talk about panhandling and praise comprehensive approaches to help the homeless. So really quick, who am I? Just in case you're joining and you're not familiar with who I am or what I do. I have been a human service practitioner for 10 plus years. I've worked in both of the family and single adult shelters within New York City. And I've also worked in long-term drug rehabilitation centers. So I've always been in a residential setting. For those who are fans of higher levels of education, I do have 3 master's degrees. One is in counseling, one is in mental health counseling, and one is a philosophy in human services. And last but not least, recently this year, I changed my name and I am a doctor of philosophy and social policy analyst and plan. So that's a quick synopsis about me. So let's roll into what we're going to talk about today. We did the introductions. We're going to define homelessness. We're going to figure out who the homeless population is and what they look like. We're going to talk about common reasons for homelessness. We're going to talk about some facts about homelessness, how to engage the homeless population, and comprehensive approaches to engaging homeless persons within the church arena. I can't see the chat, but my moderator is helping me, so I'll be able to. So if you see me look down, that's what I'm doing. All right, here we go. So basically the definition of homeless is an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, which includes a primary nighttime residence of a place not designated for regular sleeping accommodations. So a person who is sleeping in a car, a park, abandoned building, which makes them a squatter, a bus, a train station, airport, or camping ground. Also, publicly or privately operating a shelter or transitional housing, including a hotel or motel paid for by government or charitable organizations. There are also some definitions of the term of homelessness where some people equate it to a person whose name is not physically on a lease. However, for the most part, these are the 2 common definitions of what homeless is. There are multiple categories of homelessness. So we have temporary homeless displacement. So you're displaced from your home by a disaster ranging from fire to eviction. So natural disaster that happened, which led to you being homeless. And then there's also phases of eviction that led you to be homeless. There are certain criteria that make you episodically homeless. People who go in and out of homelessness, having housing for only a portion of the month, maybe staying with friends and family a period of time. People that aren't on leases would fall into that episodically homeless part. So they're constantly called couch surfers, or they end up bouncing from family and friends. But in addition to that, they also end up going into homeless shelters. So they might go into a homeless shelter, let's say a week or 2 weeks or a month, leave the homeless shelter, and then go surf couches with friends and family, go back into the shelter. That would then make them episodic. Then you have chronic homelessness. This is a person who spends more than a year without any periods of housing during this time. And for the most part, when you see homelessness or a panhandler is somebody who is soliciting funds or services on a street corner, on a highway, those persons are more than likely chronically homeless, which means they do not have a stable housing condition for over a year plus. So to also break that down a little better for us, you also have unsheltered persons, sheltered person, and then transition housing persons. So persons who are unsheltered, those are the persons you see, again, panhandling. They'll be on bridges, cars, streets, woods, tents, usually sleeping under cardboard boxes. For those of you in New York City, they're in the subway station, and they are drastically different than mole people. Mole homeless persons are different than persons who are in the subway stations or public areas sleeping. Then you have persons who are sheltered. So they end up like racetracks, abandoned buildings, which then makes them squatters, which means they still have a housing complex over them, but they're just not the landlord or lease owner. And then those who end up in shelter settings. Then you have persons who end up homeless because they are in jail, drug, alcohol treatment programs, hospitals, respites, or motels. Okay. More common reasons for homelessness include domestic violence, A lot of times, if a person is a victim to domestic violence, they will flee the situation, or once they build up the strength to flee the situation, and they will end up in something called a domestic violence shelter, which is much different and have different regulations opposed to general population shelters. Domestic violence shelters in particular have certain security measures that prevent the victim from meeting their abuser. Persons who are evicted. Eviction is a big one that lands people into shelter predominantly with family settings. So a family dynamic, meaning it's a one parent household, 2-parent household. More than likely, it was an eviction process that got them into shelter or on the streets. Loss of job or income. Of course, if you lose your job or income, then you're unable to pay your rent, which then also can lead you to being evicted. Lack of affordable housing. The lack of affordable housing that matches the cost of living in your current city or residence. The also common reasons for homelessness, hazardous housing conditions. So you have a slumlord or there's dangerous construction around that place. So you end up vacating that housing condition, ending up in shelter or possibly ending up on the street. Overcrowded housing. Basically, you don't have a sleeping space in the location, or that person does not have a sleeping space in the location that they are residing. Therefore, they might end up in a homeless shelter or on the street. Natural disasters such as hurricane, blizzard, storm, fire that cause damage to the home, which can either put them in temporary or permanent shelter stays. Criminal record, drug abuse, a list of persons previous with criminal convictions. In most states, they will not rent, or they tend to have underlying discrimination against persons with criminal records, but in particular, drug abuse, especially among the single adult population. So one first question we got so far was, can shelter persons be panhandlers? Yes, they can be panhandlers, and we'll talk about that more in detail in a moment. Currently in the United States, as of yesterday, there are 561,000 people homeless in these United States. So basically ask yourself right now, and again, if we were in a setting that we would do a little poster board of what homelessness looks to you. So right now in the chat, and this is to be as real and transparent as possible, what comes to mind when you think of a homeless person or family? I'm gonna give you about a minute or two. So again, nobody's judging here. So write what that kind of looks like. So again, when you think of a homeless person, when you think of homelessness, write what it kind of looks like to you or what comes to mind. All right, so far we got sleeping in a car, staying in hotel. Try to get more descriptive, like what it smells like, what it looks like, how it presents itself. Formerly incarcerated. Poor hygiene and health. Okay. I know y'all keep looking at me, look down. Mother with children. So yes, this is what the common stereotype of what a homeless person looks like. Why? Because that is what you frequently would see. Bad smelling, a mother with their child, sleeping in the car, sleeping someplace that's not well kept, having bad hygiene, strong smells. So now ask yourself right now, most of you defined it as the top one that says, this is how you look or see a homeless person. And that is the stereotype of what a homeless person looks like. However, I'm here to tell everybody that the bottom is really what homelessness looks like. When you work actively in the field, the percentage of persons that look like the top image is actually 25% or lower than the person on the bottom. So I said all of that to say that the homeless person can look just like me and you, and they can literally come to work the same way, have a fresh haircut the same way, but we tend to automatically assume and go with the stereotype that the top version is what all homelessness looks like. We also tend to assume, now I actually ask persons this directly to say, when you think of a homeless person, what kind of things do you say? So you commonly hear somebody say, if they would just find a job, they would be okay. They're lazy. They just trying to beat the system. They smell and they all use drugs. So that's a common assumption again. So think about yourself. I want everybody to do like a self-assessment of yourself and how when you think of homelessness or when you've ever seen a homeless person, if something similar to these quotes came to mind. So really quickly, my research focused on the extended shelter stay of homeless millennials in New York City shelters. It was a qualitative research study on the extended shelter stay of single adult homeless millennials currently residing in New York City shelters. So within New York City, a little background, in order for you to be considered a long-term stayer, you need to be in shelter longer than 6 months. However, some of my research indicated that the stability process that a homeless person goes through in the shelter system, particularly millennials, kind of automatically puts them into that 6-month mark, and the services provided are not as adequate. So we're going to go through all of those themes as it relates to the engagement of a homeless person. And just for those scholars who are in the room, I did use the emerging adult construct, which is a derivative of the generational theory. And basically it explains that through a course of life, when a person is developing, they're going into emerging adulthood. However, the millennial generation in particular may be resisting the factors connected to emerging adulthood, such as home ownership, such as leaving the home, things of that nature, and they're choosing to stay in early adulthood. And then basically 5 themes emerged from that research. So again, I'm using my research and my experience to explain the service delivery that a homeless person is experiencing, and then we'll go into how the church can also assist. Really quickly, a quote: homelessness should not be one of the things in life that we look forward to and we should try to prevent in any way possible. Quick facts about homelessness. Most of this was taken from my research as well. Homelessness, we've already determined, is a lack of stable living situation or residence. There's no definitive cause of homelessness. It is not good to automatically assume that the homeless episode that person is going through is something that they could have controlled, because they could not have controlled it as well, which led to their homelessness. And it's not good to assume that all homeless people are just in one category. Many factors can lead to homelessness. We've gone through those already. Common reasons for homelessness amongst millennials would be rising rent and stagnating incomes. And there's also limited affordable housing options and a population with greater needs than provided that can control in most major cities. Families comprise of 40% of those who are homeless, and these stats are for United States to cover everybody. 42% of homeless children are under the age of 6. So, for example, when the pandemic hit, one of the things that had concerned me in particular from my experience is that a lot of school-age children no longer had school lunch, socialization skills, are things that led them to go into school. And a large population of those kids are in shelter. A child is born into poverty every 33 seconds. Families with children comprise one of the most fastest growing segments of the homeless population today. More than 15% of Americans live in poverty, including 1 in 5 children, the highest rate in this world. Almost 60% of Americans will spend at least 1 year below the poverty line. A lot of you are like, I wonder when my year was. A lot of us will spend 1 year below the poverty line at some point between the ages of 25 and 75. There is no city or county anywhere in the United States where a worker making minimum wage can afford a fair market rate 1-bedroom apartment. The cost of rent and utilities for a typical 2-bedroom apartment has increased by 41% in the last decade. 2 million additional American children will fall victim to the foreclosure crisis over the next 2 years. So now let's roll into our common themes. First one is limited exposure to housing resources and information. Stop assuming that because of a person's age that they know certain things. And this is particular when you're talking about families with children and parents. It's not automatic to assume that this person knows how to do something or has the skills to do something. So in that theme, it broke down to knowledge of eligibility criteria for housing resources and information, unaware of housing options, and limited single adult housing options. So basically, they just don't know and nobody's telling them. Difficulty finding employment or jobs with livable wages. As I said before, the minimum wage criteria, thinking about New York City, is at $15. And a lot of people would be like, wow, that's amazing. However, the cost of living does not match the minimum wage amount. Therefore, this causes certain problems with them trying to locate a better job, a good paying job, to then find housing. Limited engagement with shelter staff. So if a homeless person that you know of is in the shelter, it is reported that there is limited engagement within with the shelter staff. More than likely, that is because caseloads are higher. Human service professionals tend to have really large caseloads that have high demands. So and sometimes there will be clients, especially if they're compliant and don't cause any issues, that they might not be engaged as much. You tend to have, or human service providers in shelter in particular, depending on the size of the shelter, you tend to be more reactive than proactive. So you try to engage those persons who might need more attention. So they have limited engagement with shelter staff. The other thing is poor socialization skills. Now, that's not as common as we're thinking, like, oh, they just don't know how to socialize. That's not what I'm referring to. That refers to that they're not informing their social networks that they're homeless, therefore they're lacking support systems and have limited interactions with those friends. So through my research, the single adults that I had interviewed, their families and friends did not know they were homeless. They just acted as normal, as if everything was fine, and then was reporting to the shelter later that evening. Last but not least, trauma. Trauma is a universal effect. However, most people who end up in the shelter system or who come into shelter system have been institutionalized before. So they do have the foster care system or adoption system. They're not really big on authority or have had an authority figure in their life. And then they might have mental health or drug abuse concerns, which then led them to coming into shelter. So again, for the scholars in the room, I did use the generational theory. And each generation basically has its own persona. And the reason why I use this theory is because I was categorizing the millennial generation in particular to further explain why they would be in shelter. Based on the stereotype of millennials, they are narcissistic and they're focused on self. However, they are the highest undergraduate educated generation to date. Therefore, they should be more marketable in the job market. However, they are coming into shelter more frequently than other generations. I use the emerging adulthood construct. Again, I had explained it earlier, but the emerging adulthood construct basically talks about the phase between adolescence to full-fledged adulthood. And I used it because it was explaining that millennials might be refusing these features such as identity, self-focus, feeling in between, and instability. They were blatantly refusing to do those things, which was landing them in shelter. So now let's talk about the church. We got 10 minutes to talk about church, and then we're going to do some question and answers. Okay? So let's make it very clear. Homelessness is not a disease, and it's not something that will be cured. It's also not something that can completely vanish. Okay? So a lot of times we like to think of it that way. However, there are some instances, believe it or not, where a person is choosing or comes to some type of contentment with being homeless. And the reason why I'm saying that is because in New York City particularly, we are a sanctuary city, and there are only 3 sanctuary cities in the United States. Sanctuary city right to shelter mandate means that everybody who comes into those cities has the right to shelter. No matter what their status in life is, they have the right to shelter. That is Boston, Massachusetts. That is New York City. And that is Los Angeles, California. Those three in particular, no matter who you are, no matter what you own, nothing. You can go to those three cities, you can seek shelter, and those cities will give you shelter. So once you think about those kind of modalities, everybody in New York City that is homeless is assigned a temporary shelter. Some people, however, choose to sleep on the subway, right? And I'm only using New York City because this is where I'm at, but in case it is familiar with your area, you would understand. And that is, those kind of factors include safety reasons, okay? So some shelters might not be the safest. It is actually, in fact, safer to sleep on the street and panhandle than it is to go live in a shelter. So let's roll into church people or church. Number one, stop judging. Again, I use the word assume a lot because we need to be very clear and conscious of how we look at them, how we address them, and the stereotype that we automatically connected. The media portrays homeless people like the background image that you see here. But again, I want to reiterate, 75% of the homeless population is your friend, is your neighbor, is the person that you happen to see at the coffee shop. It is not to automatically assume that 100% of them are on the street, because they are not. Get to know them. Understanding a person in general goes a long way. Be very intentional on how you approach them. Be mindful of your facial expressions, whether they have a smell or don't have a smell. Just be mindful of that, and remember that they are human beings. The smell at that point, in case you are engaging somebody who is street homeless, the smell is out of their control, right? So you can't just be like, well, I'm not going to talk to them, or I'm not going to go over there because of their smell. The other thing about it is, the other stereotype that I did not talk about is we just believe that all homeless people, street homeless people in particular, are violently mentally ill. But it might just be my career stance of 10 plus years that I would be surrounded by 100 homeless people before I be surrounded by 100 church people, because they're in an arena where they, despite not having anything to lose, as we like to follow, they appreciate certain things much differently than other persons. The church must be intentional in community outreach. Do not assume that a homeless person needs something. Find out and ask. What are you saying, Xellex? I'm gonna tell you in the next slide, because we tend to assume that this is what the person needs, but you really should just ask them, and I'll talk about that in 1 minute. Educate your congregation, and this does not have to be the pastor. This can be anybody within the church, but you all have to understand that we're all a paycheck away from a paycheck or a disaster away from being homeless. So you're not exempt from this happening to you. So you have to be mindful of that, and you need to be empathetic to the person that it's happening to. So use community agencies to help educate your congregation. Promote an awareness of causes and solutions to help the homeless. You can look at it from a biblical perspective. However, this has to do with practicality and meeting a person where they are. So become the solution. Think outside of the box, right? Anything is possible. The church, in my opinion, has the arena and the resources to start develop things that impact the community. I'm not opposed to the Sunday morning worship experience. I really appreciate it. However, the church should also be that place where people are getting resources, information. We should be employing our own people to move forward and build up our communities. Bigger impact. So let's go back to that part when I talked about earlier, when you shouldn't assume what homeless people need. So a lot of times, and this has been my experience again, we just assume that homeless people are hungry and that they need food because you're looking at the 25% that might be on the street, panhandling. However, they probably don't need that, right? And you never asked, you never sat down and had a ministry to ask what's needed. So for example, in the 3 cities that I know of, that I just told you about, that are right to shelter mandate cities, homeless people here get 3 meals and a snack and a shelter every day. They have shower opportunities. They have drop-in centers. So if you knew that already, it's not automatic to assume that because this person is panhandling, that they need more food or that they need more stuff. The other thing is that shelters tend to get a lot of donations. So you should think outside of the box. It ties back into becoming a bigger solution. Think of healthcare services that you can offer or a clinic that you can launch at your shelter. Think of tutoring services, because a lot of times people who live in shelter, for families in shelter, they don't have a table for their child to sit at to do homework, right? So particularly in the shelter I'm in now, units are really small to the point where it's literally just a bed. When you live in a shelter, it is not my responsibility as a shelter director, so I switch lenses for you, to give you living space. I'm supposed to give you some place to sleep and a roof over your head. So you're looking at the New York City again, 1.1 million children that half of them might not have somewhere to sit and do homework. So you have to think about having a bigger impact. Become the outreach. Develop eviction outreach project. People get evicted in certain areas, not understanding squatters' rights. There's a formula that you should use when going into housing in the first place. And basically it's the 50-30-20 rule, but 50% of your earned income should go to your rent. That's on average. Of course, you should try to aim higher than that. However, these kind of formulas, they need to learn, and the church can be that avenue. Develop housing workshops that promote home ownership. So we definitely need to focus on home ownership, not just in the Black community in particular, but across the board, but predominantly in the Black community. However, where do you learn that? Ask yourself this, where do you learn that? I know that when I started my homeless career, I started off as a director of housing. However, I was living at home with my mama. So I didn't know anything about a lease at that point. I didn't know anything about a lease. I didn't know anything about housing markets. I knew nothing. I had to learn that process. And that is why it brought me to the point where somebody should have taught that. So promote home ownership, credit building. Your credit rate matters when you're looking for housing. And it is something that keeps people in shelter longer, right? So they might have savings. They'll get the job, they clean up nice, we got them some clothes, and their credit rating is 400. Now they can't get an apartment, and it keeps them in shelter longer. Think of employment avenues for persons, internship avenues, income, and invest. Become client-centered. I don't know how many times to say this, but you have to meet the person where they are. This doesn't really happen in church often. We tend to assume that they walked in and now we need to bring them here automatically. However, you're supposed to come down here to the person and meet them where they're at to bring them up here. So there's a sense of divide. When a homeless person walks into the church, I'm pretty sure 5 people start staring at the person and automatically assume that they might be trying to do something negative opposed to saying good morning. So we need to think about that when we're engaging persons who are homeless or don't look like us. Consider harm reduction in your approach. Let's say you have somebody in your church who's homeless or who uses drugs. Think of harm reduction. Think of ways to give them tools that are starting to help them be healthier, to build that rapport. If you have my opinion, again, don't run with this if it doesn't work for you. However, if you have a drug addict that you know about, let's say who's actively shooting heroin in your church, clean needles will help. Again, you're probably like, why would I provide them clean needles? But mostly because you're doing harm reduction. You got to get them to the point of trying to come off of what that is. Homelessness the same way. You can't just automatically say to them, okay, you smell, bro, let's go take a shower. No, you work your way into that conversation and you work your way into where they want to go and what they want to do. So understand their trauma and then become more empathetic to their trauma would go a long way. I talked about this already. However, the church, I'm talking particularly to church or leaders or community leaders, we should think about creating affordable housing options or connecting to our cities to assist in creating affordable housing options. There's plenty of funding, federal funding in particular, to assist with this, especially in certain areas. Create employment opportunities or internships. So provide employment or work with an agency to employ congregants. Most non-for-profits or human service agencies more than likely have a policy that 10% of their employment rate has to be their clientele. So most people don't know that. So for example, homeless services, 10% of the people that we hire have to have experienced homelessness at some point in time because it connects to one of our funding sources. So think about connecting with an agency who, let's say they're not providing employment, they would at least give this person an internship. So that way in the shelter, they can be adding this internship to their resume, which then can make them easier to move out of shelter. Create resources, provide mental health resources, criminal justice advocacy, and lawyers. That is big to assist persons, again, because they really don't know. Do not assume that people just know because they're 50 plus or that they're 25 or whatever it is. They really don't know. Most of my clients come in here, first time shelter experience. They don't know anything about shelter. They've never been homeless. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know what they're eligible for. They don't know. So the church can be an avenue to create such resources. Provide simple basic needs. Again, remember I said to ask what the need is. That's number one. And then try to provide that around whatever the ministry is at the church. So this was really interesting to me. I was doing additional research. So there are ways that you can get persons' addresses. So if you see somebody who's street home, this is for street homeless or people who tend to drop into your shelters that don't have, not shelters, to your churches that aren't living at a shelter. You can now get virtual addresses or mailboxes. And you can actually just have a part of your church that has mailboxes for street homeless people, because if they don't have an address, they usually can't get whatever benefits your city is offering, right? So maybe the church can have a section of the building, if you have that space, to have like little mailboxes, and then you provide them with either a virtual address or give them a new address. So that way those persons who then go over to the other side, provide drop-in centers. If you have the spacing or the tools, allow people to drop in. Some people like just need somewhere to sleep. Some people just need somewhere to take a shower. Some people just want to brush their teeth and they just want to go back on the street. Again, I didn't ask you to judge them about going back on the street. I said provide whatever the basic need is. So a lot of times they have drop-in centers. So if you combine those two together, if your church ministry can do it, you can provide street homeless people with an address so that we know that they're getting benefits, as well as also provide them with a drop-in center. Some places just drop in, you know, you can give them a pamphlet if you want to, but drop in, get a word of encouragement, quick bite, quick snack, quick meal, brush their teeth, and they go back into the street. To a homeless person, home is literally where the heart is. Any questions? Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. Thank y'all, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The other thing about for those who are not in right to shelter mandates or sanctuary cities, some other cities require people to pay using their benefits or Social Security, but you would have to do the research in your city to determine what's happening. There are shelters. However, outside of the places who are right to shelter mandates, there's a time frame for other cities. So for example, you might find like Long Island, okay? It's still part of New York, but it's not New York City. So we have a right to shelter mandate here, but Long Island does not. So Long Island, you have like 90 days to come in here, do what you're supposed to do, and leave. That's not the same on this side as it relates to the right to shelter mandate. We have some people who come into shelter and they really do live here, not that they should, but they end up living here and trying their best to get out. I'm just trying to find some questions. I'm just reading everybody's comments. Right, no more bologna sandwiches. How can we effectively still do mission outreach to homeless within the COVID guidelines? Okay, so if you connect with an agency that is willing to work with you, they'll provide you, or the shelter resident has to sign a HIPAA consent to obviously talk to you. But once you start talking to them, you can talk to them virtually. Most of them have devices. Again, stop assuming that they don't have whatever it is. Most of them have devices. Most cities are providing them with smart devices, not so much flip phones, because most of this stuff is electronic anyway when they're applying for benefits. So just go ahead and do the virtual kind of setup. The other thing is you can do it using the CDC protocols. So we do some face-to-face now, but for the most part, we're virtual when we're engaging the clients. I send tons of emails now to my clients to make sure they're engaged. But I have to physically see people's children, right? My staff does. So we still have to see them. So you can do it where, like, let's say you're having one-on-one sessions, and then you let the person come in one at a time. You provide the resources such as masks, face shields, gloves. Again, we assume that they just won't comply. They really will comply with whatever you're saying to try to meet whatever need that you're trying to provide to them. I hope I answered you, Will. Can you get funded for the mailboxes? I'm not sure about if you can get funded for the mailboxes. Some virtual mailboxes you can buy in the bulk. I can do some research, and maybe later for the think tank, if y'all want to join me for the home security one, because it does focus on homelessness, we can start to brainstorm that together. But you can, I know that there's ways, I think they're like $5, $7 a box. I mean, you really could use the Ministry of Kindness too, but I don't know. Can shelter persons still be panhandling? Absolutely. Believe it or not, people who are in New York City, the average panhandler makes $30,000 a year, which is more than minimum wage. That's in New York City. Churches in the suburbs, what do you recommend? So the suburbs also have shelter options. I say that you connect with the shelter in your area or community-based organization. So for example, there are home bases across New York State. And home base is something that helps with homeless prevention. And most cities have this as well. So there are agencies that are helping people not become homeless. So they end up going to housing court with you to make sure you don't end up homeless. So I think you should connect. There is some place in the suburbs to connect with them and figure out how the church can be a resource. I always appreciate as an administrator in shelter when somebody calls me and they don't naturally assume that I need books. I don't need books, for my children, or I don't need, I definitely don't need the free hotel lotions that y'all get from traveling, so things like that. I like when people ask the question, think outside of the box. Think about maxi pads and tampons. Think about diapers. Think about masks right now because of COVID. Think about vitamin C if you want to provide stuff like that. Think about health clinic options that they can come to where you're connecting with like a local clinic, but assisting them with transportation, right? Most people don't provide transportation getting to and from the clinics, which is why they don't go, which is why they don't get the health care that they need. So maybe the church van or something can just start transporting people back and forth to their destinations. How about mobile laundromats? So most shelters have laundromats inside of them. And in some cases, on the single side, they help them do their laundry. On the family side, they go to laundromats in New York City if they don't have laundry accommodations inside. How can churches remove fear when offering services? I think fear is the main problem. Fear. So the fear is attached to the assumption. It's also attached to what you see on the media, right? So I was a victim to this as well. Before I started working in shelter, and I was 22 when I started working in drug rehab, and I had a look of how they supposed to look. I had a stereotype of what they supposed to look like. Once I started working with them, and I realized that they look just like me and you, Sarah. Like, you see what I'm saying? They look identical to us. Like, you really could not tell them apart. But the difference is they're not carrying it with them. So a lot of times we just assume that they're in the subways, on the street, they're gonna bust you upside the head. We tend to think that, and they're not. They're not violent. It's not an automatic assumption to think they're all mentally ill and that's why they're homeless. It could really be something as simple as their rent was $1,000 and now it's $3,000 because of gentrification, and now they're homeless. So you can't assume that, whatever. But fear goes back to the client-centered approach and trying to educate the congregation or your peers on how to engage. I've always said this to most of my peers and even my family. I ask people directly, and that's across the board on whatever I don't know. I ask the person who's experiencing it. So in the homeless population, that's who I work with, I ask them. But if my client is transgender, I ask the process. I ask the questions. If my client is Muslim, I ask this so I can better understand, so that I can always meet my clients where they are. Because some textbooks just don't have the same vibe. I wonder, how does that look differently in California, particularly Los Angeles, which is where our ministry is located. Los Angeles has a high level of homelessness, also connected to the immigration that comes into Los Angeles, similar to New York City, but they're much closer to Los Angeles. But it is a right to shelter mandate over there. So they probably have the same stipulations that we have as far as seeking shelter. If a small church wants to get involved with the homeless, what would be the first few steps to take to get started? Simple things. If you can do drop-in centers, if you can do the mailboxes, those are all, they sound small, but they're really major. Here in New York City, we do something called a hope walk. It's called an outreach walk. So you go out in the middle of the night and you engage all of the street homeless persons and just make sure they're okay. Like, again, you're not saying to them, hey, you got to get off the street. You just check on them to say, hey, I'm just checking, make sure you're okay. Do you need anything? And they might really tell you, hey, I need a blanket. So you'll carry certain things, a blanket, a pillow, a sheet, and they'll just stay right where they're at. I know we're cutting close to our time, but our city is way behind homeless services, many shelters are sleep only. So kind of similar here, the single adult population, they are supposed to leave in the morning, but they're not necessarily put out. So they are supposed to leave in the morning and look for jobs and then come back. They have a curfew and a bed thing on that division as well. On the family division, we have a curfew as well. However, we don't necessarily put the family out, because a lot of times right now, especially with remote learning, the children are upstairs with their parents doing remote learning. Yes, definitely, incontinent diapers as well. There are a lot of elderly people in shelters, believe it or not. There are a lot of elderly people in shelters. I hope you got some key. If there's no more questions, we got 2 more minutes. What about those homeless who are silent, those who live with relatives and friends who may be members in our church who may not talk about their homelessness? Engage all of them the same way and think collectively. So start doing general ministries, in my opinion. So when you do the whole educating the congregation piece, they might show up, and then, once they get more to share. Similar to most things in the Black community, we don't like to tell our business. Everything is in-house. So homelessness or needing of services is one of those things. So if you just start off by doing something like a small information session about, let's say, evictions or housing resources, maybe they'll come, and then you'll start to be able to break that ice as it relates to making them more comfortable, and they'll break their silence. In this new landscape where churches are unable to gather and are having to shift to a more outward focus, what are some ways to shift our church folk to embrace ministry that addresses the needs of the homeless? Again, I want to say think outside of the box. First, you have to gain the information for your particular area on how homelessness is. Right? Every area is not necessarily affected by street homelessness. And when I say homelessness, I want y'all to understand, I keep talking about street homelessness because that's the part that people tend to look at. If there's a lot of people outside your church or around your community that's messing up the community by being street homeless, that's the population we tend to think about. But we have to become, as a church dynamic altogether, we have to become more trauma informed and understand that everybody is walking in with a problem, and we need to meet them where they're at. we automatically assume when they come into the church that they just want Jesus. But, you know, it's not an automatic assumption there either. So sometimes they're coming in and yes, they already know Jesus, which is why they probably walked in. So now it's a matter of engaging them, meeting them where they're at, finding out what resources they might need. You can actually infuse it into the class leader system. When the class leaders are engaging, this is for Amy Zion Church. I don't know if there's other persons on, I'm sorry. The class leaders should be more engaged with a person's spiritual development, but also the practicality of their life. Like, how is their day going? Where are they sleeping at night? Is everything okay? So you can infuse it in the training to the class leader system. And then when they're connecting virtually, they would be able, if they're a member. But then I also think that there should be somebody in the lay that is engaging people who are not members, who are more like drop-ins, and continuously educate the congregation. I hope I answered you. What ways can we rethink or convert our church facilities to aid in this work? A lot of cleaning, honestly. The shelters have been running through this whole pandemic, right? The church buildings that run, the church ministry should have kept running. So shelters, in fact, so like, for example, we put in certain cleaning precautions so that we can continuously engage our clients. We put up plexiglass in between the case manager and the worker in some of our shelters, but here we gave simple things like we give out masks every Thursday to try to make sure we're engaging people, and we gave out face shields. And when they leave their unit, they have to wear them. Especially when engaging with staff. So those small kind of precautions you can put into place, but you can still actively engage them. Once you have a phone number or an email for them, you do the same virtual check-ins that you would do like with your friends and family. So like call them up, text them. We do wellness checks here. So if you don't see them for a couple of days, you'll text them and say, hey, just checking in, make sure you're okay. I do weekly virtual, I call them virtual house meetings to inform them on where the state of where New York State is at currently with the pandemic, so that they're constantly informed, so that these adults can make a decision to, when they're walking out the building, that they understand what's happening. The key to this is education and communication, right? Educate your congregation, communicate with them, and provide them practical resources. Homelessness is something that is not just impacting their physical dwelling, it's also impacting their mental health. Right? So I just need everybody to think about to happen to your house right now, and you and your family got in your car and then you had to go to shelter. Think about the, let's say you have a family dynamic. I know we're running over time. I'm sorry. I have to stop before LaKesha gets me. Think about the man who might be heading that household, how he feels, and now how it's impacting his family. You have to think about it like that when you're engaging people. Think about the single mom of 3 kids that she can't figure it out and she doesn't have anything past a high school diploma. So she needs experience. So she needs an internship. She needs to know what she's eligible for in order to move forward. Pastoral care. Sometimes I think for pastoral care, the pastor, in my opinion, I've done this in most of my workshops, I don't think everything is the pastor's responsibility. I think some people should bring it up to the pastor and then execute it, right? So I think that if you're I always promote wellness committees in churches, because it's more than just the nurses unit at this point, if that's your tradition. Like, I think that we should be engaging persons on a trauma-informed lens at all times, right? And then build them up. And homelessness is no different. The panhandler you see on the street, say good morning. Like, even if you don't have $1, like, say good morning, right? If you have 50 cents, it goes a long way, because that's a form of ministry, because it builds rapport. But if they're coming into your church, right, engage them the same way you would engage me, like when I came in. So just because the smells are different or the looks are different, it doesn't mean anything. And again, the subdivisions of your church should give community-based resources. When people stop church, they go back to life. Right? So after they leave church and they have a wonderful time and you done fed them, that person go back to the street, or that person goes back to the shelter. So what is the church doing? I want you to ask yourself this when you go back to your church, or if you are a pastor, what are you doing that's meeting the person's secular issues, right? How is that building them or giving them resources to move forward? And I think we're over time. I'm cutting into somebody else, unless we're in a networking session. I'm cutting into somebody else's time. And definitely research this thing. There's a social worker in every church, and I can bet money on that. There's a social worker, there's a mental health clinician in every church, or there's simply a empathetic mother in every church. And therefore, you should think of those things. Virtual, again, let's just recap: virtual addresses, mailboxes, drop-in centers. Don't automatically assume that they need those things. Think outside the box. Definitely holistic. That's always my approach when dealing with this population. But I think we might be good. Thank you, Reverend Williams.